Good morning. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar about Ohio's woodpeckers. I'm Melissa Yapel, and we do have some other fascinating webinars lined up for you going into February next week. If you don't know, Groundhog Day is coming up, so we're going to do a webinar same time, same place. So 10 a.m. next Wednesday on hibernation fascination. So please join us then. We have a slew of other webinars scheduled throughout February, several about different critters and also celebrating Black History Month. I'll send a link in the Q&A box for anyone that's interested and wants to check them out. But we have a lot of people joining us already today, so I don't want to hesitate with getting started. I'm just going to introduce who I have helping me with the Q&A. Please utilize the Q&A box. If you have any questions, we will do our very best to answer them for you. I have Jenna Winters with me. So there's Jenna. Hey, Jenna. Kaylin Callender, who is from Lake Hope State Park. Kaylin, hi. And Lauren Stewart at Mommy Bay State Park. And we are all going to be answering questions that you may have. But our star of the show today is Julie Gee. Julie is with us from Burr Oak State Park. So go ahead and take it away, Julie.
All right. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm so glad to be with you this morning to talk about Ohio's woodpeckers. I'm going to share my screen. Whoops. I need to do that one more time. Okay, Alyssa, everything looking all right?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, thank you. As Alyssa said, I'm Julie Gee, and I'm the naturalist at Burr Oak State Park. Just a little bit about Burr Oak. Burr Oak is located in southeast Ohio, and we have about 3,000 acres of land, a 660-acre lake. And if you like to hike, Burr Oak is a great place to visit. We have 23 miles of hiking trails. Most of the habitat there is eastern deciduous forest, so wonderful hiking opportunities. Please come out and see us at Burr Oak. Today, though, we're talking about Ohio's woodpeckers and woodpeckers in general. Woodpeckers have a variety of adaptations that help them survive. But those adaptations also make them very fun, entertaining birds to watch. So today I'm going to start with looking at some woodpecker adaptations. And an adaptation is any feature that a plant or an animal has that helps it fit where it lives. So adaptations that help woodpeckers survive and thrive in the habitat and the environment which they live in. We'll look at woodpecker adaptations and then we'll move on to talk specifically about the woodpeckers found in Ohio. Before we do that though, I know that a lot of you joining us today have seen woodpeckers before. And I'd like you to think about the woodpeckers that you've seen and answer this question. How many species of woodpeckers have you seen? Not just in Ohio, but anywhere. If you have traveled around the United States, or if you have traveled to other countries and seen woodpeckers, you can just answer the poll that's being sent to you about how many species of woodpeckers you have seen in your lifetime.
Julie, I can let you know when the answers start coming in.
Okay. All right. So we're going to move on and talk about woodpecker adaptations. Probably One of the most familiar adaptation that you would be able to think about is the beak of a woodpecker. Woodpeckers have a sharp chisel-like beak, and it's really the basic tool that woodpeckers have to use. They use that beak for breaking up wood. While they break up wood, they're prying for insects. They can excavate nest holes, and they do something called drumming with their beak. Woodpeckers do not sing like songbirds sing. Instead, they drum, and that's that fast rat-a-tat-tat that you will hear on a tree. That is used to establish territories and to attract mates. When woodpeckers are drumming, they can hit their beak against the wood 20 times per second. And I know that when I hear or see woodpeckers drumming, I think to myself, how can they be slamming their beak and head against a tree without suffering some type of brain damage or damage to their skull or to their neck? How can they do that? Well, the reason they can do that is because of the adaptations that they have in their skull. To prevent physical and neurological damage, the frontal portion of a woodpecker skull is comprised of both plate-like bone and spongy bone. And the area that has the square on it in this image, that square on the frontal portion of the skull, is where the impact, the highest impact that occurs when the woodpeckers are pecking, whenever they're pecking or drumming. So that frontal portion has a combination of platy bone, which is indicated by letter B in that diagram that you see, and also spongy bone, which you can see indicated by letter A in the diagram. That photo is also showing you a really neat photograph of that bone. So with that combination of spongy and platy bone, there's really good shock absorption happening in the skull of the woodpecker. Also, another difference in the woodpecker skull from other birds is that there's less internal fluid surrounding the brain. So think about an egg. If you have a hard-boiled egg and you shake it, the yolk isn't going to be moving around. But if you have a raw egg and you shake it, that yolk is going to move and slosh around inside of the egg. With less internal fluid surrounding the brain of the woodpecker, the brain is not going to move around as much as it would if there was more fluid. Also, the skull has reduced space inside the cranium itself. So again, less room for that brain to move around. There are also a couple of other adaptations that prevent damage to the woodpecker's brain and head and neck. They have that chisel-like beak, remember, it's very sharp. So when that sharp beak penetrates into wood, it penetrates directly. It doesn't stop when that beak hits the wood. That actually helps resist damage. And then woodpeckers also have stronger neck muscles than other types of birds. And again, that really supports that activity of pecking, breaking up wood, and drumming.
Hey, Julie, we have a question, and then I'll give you the results. Woodpecker Wiz asks, would the pecking also be used as communication?
It is, especially the drumming. The drumming is used to advertise territories to other birds and to attract mates. So it's definitely communication. Okay,
and then we have about a little over 50% of respondents answered B, that they've seen 3 to 5 species of woodpeckers, and close to about 35% of respondents answered C. They've seen between 6 and 8 woodpecker species.
Okay, very nice. So most of you have seen several species of woodpeckers, and maybe later on I'll have to ask, if we have time, are most of those species you've seen in Ohio, or did you get to see some species in other places? But we will move on to the next adaptation that I want to talk about that is just incredible, and that is the tongue of the woodpecker. Woodpeckers have a bone embedded in their tongue that helps them to extract insects from trees. This tongue is just so amazing. The tongue is extremely long. It begins at the forehead, right between the eyes here. And then, of course, it's attached to the skull between the eyes. The tongue splits into two parts, loops around the back of the skull and between the neck, comes up underneath into the lower beak where it's still split, but then it joins into one tongue again when it leaves the beak to take action, to look for food and to get food. So there are these two strands of the tongue that wrap around the back of the head. The tongue is stored back in the skull. There's sort of a series of cartilage and, of course, bones that aren't shown in this artwork here. But it's fascinating because the bird can store that long tongue, which acts as another shock absorber for the woodpecker. It's another way to eliminate any type of damage when the woodpecker is using its beak and hammering against a tree. Woodpeckers, again, have extremely long tongues, and different species of woodpeckers have different types of tongues. The lengths differ, and there's some different arrangements at the tips of the tongues, which I will talk about when we get to the individual species of Ohio woodpeckers. A third adaptation that woodpeckers have relates to their feet and their toes. Most songbirds have 3 toes that are forward facing and 1 backward facing toes. However, most woodpeckers have 2 toes facing forward and 2 toes facing back. This is known as a zygodactyl foot. These zygodactyl feet allow woodpeckers to easily grasp onto trees and climb trees. And of course, it allows them to grasp onto other structures too. But the fact that they've got these 2 toes forward and 2 toes back give them that advantage for climbing up and grasping onto trees. Here's an image to show you. There's 2 toes forward you can see here and 2 toes back. And then on the other foot of this woodpecker, 2 toes forward and 2 toes back, that zygodactyl foot. The last adaptation that I want to mention relates to the tail feathers. Woodpeckers move up trees by hopping up trees, and they depend on their stiff tail feathers to act as a prop. You can almost think of the woodpecker's tail feathers as being a 3rd foot for the woodpecker. It's that important. That tail feather props and helps balance the woodpecker as they move up and down trees. And it's just amazing to see and how they really are like the 3rd foot of a tripod for the woodpecker. Now let's go ahead and delve into our Ohio woodpeckers. We have 7 species of woodpeckers in Ohio. There are a variety of sizes, and we're going to start with the smallest to the largest woodpeckers. Are you still there with me, Alyssa?
I am, yeah.
Okay, I lost you, and I was afraid I had lost the sound. Okay.
Nope, I'm still here. I do have, while we're talking, I do have one question I wanted to ask. Evan wrote in and asked, is it true that their tongues wrap around their brains for extra cushion?
Yes, that's what I was just mentioning. And if you saw the skull diagram that I had when we were talking about the tongue, it wraps around the back of the skull and is stored there, which actually gives it some extra shock absorption, in addition to the wonderful specialized bone and types of bone that they have in their skull. So yes, it's fascinating, this tongue that they have. So we'll move on to Ohio's 7 species of woodpeckers. We have a variety of sizes of woodpeckers in Ohio. We're going to look from the smallest to the largest. And some, of course, are more common than others. Some maybe you've seen all of these. Maybe there are going to be a few species you haven't seen before. But all woodpeckers, in my opinion, are very fun to watch. As we start looking at Ohio's woodpeckers, I'd like you to take a look at this photo and answer the question, is this a downy woodpecker or a hairy woodpecker? These are the 2 woodpecker species we're going to start with our discussion. So you're going to have a poll that you can answer and tell me, do you think this is a downy or a hairy woodpecker?
So far, most people are saying downy, but we might want to give them some time to respond. So we can come back to this too if you want to keep moving, Julie.
Okay, well, I am going to give the answer. So
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, actually, there are quite a few more responses that have come in, so it's not as close as it was at the beginning. We have 18 folks saying downy and 9 saying hairy.
Okay, good to know. The downy and hairy woodpeckers are the 2 hardest woodpeckers to tell apart. And I do want to tell you that this is a hairy woodpecker. So if you guessed hairy, you were correct. But if you guessed downy and thought downy, don't feel bad, because again, these are the 2 most difficult woodpeckers to tell apart. We're going to start, though, today with our Ohio woodpecker discussion with the downy woodpecker. It is the smallest woodpecker in North America. It's about the size of a house sparrow, if you can think of a house sparrow, or an English sparrow you may have heard of. So smallest woodpecker in North America. These are extremely common at bird feeders. Again, the overall color is black and white, so you can see the black and white striping on the head, the black and white in the wings, the white belly, just this overall black and white color. But if you have a male downy woodpecker, there is a patch of red on the nape of the head. The nape is the very back portion of the head of a woodpecker, or of any bird. That's the nape area. Also, I do want to mention that all male woodpeckers have at least some red on their head. All male woodpeckers. One diagnostic feature of the downy woodpecker that's an identifying feature is the spots right here that I'm showing you, the black spots on the white outer tail feathers of the downy woodpecker. That is definitely a feature that helps separate it from the hairy woodpecker, but this can be very difficult to see. You really have to get just the right view of the downy to be able to see those spots. The downy woodpecker is named for the nasal bristles which cover its nostrils, and those bristles help keep out sawdust when the woodpecker is doing its excavating and drilling and drumming and so forth into wood. Downy woodpeckers are interesting because you can sometimes see them perched like a songbird on stems, on tree stems, tree twigs, or you can also see them perched on very small plant stems like goldenrod. The image in the upper right of the picture here is showing a downy woodpecker on a goldenrod plant, and it is getting ready to peck into the goldenrod gall, which is that round structure you see on the plant stem. Inside that gall is a larva of either a fly or a wasp, which is the type of creature that created that gall. The gall was created by the plant, but it was created in response to a fly or a wasp laying its egg on the plant stem. So downy woodpeckers are, I believe, the only woodpeckers that will probe into a gall to get that small larva out as food. Let's move on now to the hairy woodpecker. And the difference between the hairy and downy woodpecker is sometimes one of the very first identification challenges for beginning bird watchers, trying to be able to tell the difference between them. Now, the hairy woodpecker and the next three species that I'm going to talk about are all about the same size. They are all about cardinal or robin sized. So the hairy woodpecker has the same overall appearance as you can see as the downy. What you want to look for is a longer beak and larger overall body size. Also, on the hairy, the outer tail feathers do not have the spots like we were mentioning and that I showed you on the downy woodpecker outer tail feathers. So no black spotting on the outer tail feathers. It's a larger bird, about cardinal or robin sized, and it has a longer beak than the downy's going to have. Also, with both the downy and hairy woodpeckers, the female does not have any red on her head, which is the photo in the upper right that I wanted to show you. So no red on the head of the female downy or hairy. The nasal tufts of the hairy woodpecker are actually more hair-like than the bristly nasal tufts of the downy. And that is why the hairy is called a hairy woodpecker. Now keep in mind that because this is a bird, they're hair-like, but they are modified feathers. It's not hair, they're modified feathers that look hair-like. Again, these can be very challenging to identify. If you get lucky and you see them next to each other, it can be very obvious that one is the downy and one is the hairy. But if you don't see these birds side by side or next to each other on a suet feeder, they can be extremely difficult to tell apart. One trick that I have found is that if you have these woodpeckers at your suet feeder, look at the size of the bird compared to the suet basket. I have suet baskets that I put my suet in, and the downy woodpecker is almost exactly the same length as one side of a suet basket. So if I'm looking out at my suet and I see the downy woodpecker, I know it's the downy because it's no longer than one side of the suet basket. So yeah, good luck with identifying these, and please don't feel bad if you have a hard time because it can be so hard to tell them apart when they're not around each other where you have some size to compare to. Let's move on now to our next woodpecker, the yellow-bellied sapsucker. Now, first of Oh, when you hear that name, yellow-bellied sapsucker, it really sounds like a joke, because people think, wow, that's a cartoon character, or is that really the name of a bird? It is. It's named for two reasons. First of all, the yellow-bellied comes from a very pale yellow wash that this bird has on its breast or belly. And this can be extremely variable. Some birds, it's obvious to see the pale wash, but on some yellow-bellied sapsuckers, it just really is not that obvious at all. So to me, the whoever decided to name it yellow-bellied sapsucker was kind of stretching it a little bit, but the sapsucker part is quite applicable to this bird. Yellow-bellied sapsuckers drill horizontal rows of holes in plants, in trees and in woody plants. They create sap wells from drilling these holes into trees or woody plants. The sap holes or the sap wells then, of course, have sap that oozes out of the plant that then the yellow-bellied sapsucker will use with its tongue. Now, sapsuckers will use, this has been studied, that they have used over 1,000 different trees and woody plants to drill into. And this is one of those woodpeckers that has a specialized tongue. The tongue of the yellow-bellied sapsucker has bristles on the end. And it's sort of like, think of a paintbrush with bristles. These bristles allow the sapsucker to collect the sap. It's like a sap collecting brush, really, on the end of the tongue of the yellow-bellied sapsucker. So it can effectively collect that sap from the well that it created by drilling into the plant. Female yellow-bellied sapsuckers do not have a red throat like the male. So the female pictured here, you can see, still has the red cap, but no red throat. Yellow-bellied sapsuckers not only eat the sap from the sap wells, but of course they eat lots of insects that are also attracted to the sap, and they literally will defend their sap well territories from other birds that come for the sap and from even small mammals that come for the sap in these sap wells. At night, bats and flying squirrels will use the sap wells. So this is quite an effective system that the yellow-bellied sapsuckers have to feed not only themselves, but lots of other creatures in the same area. One very distinctive feature of the yellow-bellied sapsucker is that it is the only migratory woodpecker in Ohio and in eastern North America. Their yellow-bellied sapsuckers are going to depart their breeding range in September and early October, mostly up in Canada and northern US states. They'll leave that breeding range and head south for their wintering grounds in the southern US, Mexico, and Central America. We do have yellow-bellied sapsuckers, as you can see on this map, here in Ohio right now in the winter time. I have yellow-bellied sapsuckers that visit my suet feeders at home on a regular basis. So this winter, I have seen both male and female sapsuckers at the suet. Some winters I'll only see the males, but we have them, so don't be surprised, especially if you are in this area here in southern Ohio. Don't be surprised to see a yellow-bellied sapsucker appear at your suet feeder. One fascinating partnership or connection with the yellow-bellied sapsucker has to do with ruby-throated hummingbirds. Ruby-throated hummingbirds, when they head north in the spring, need a lot of energy to support their migration. And when Ruby-throated hummingbirds first start heading north in the spring. There aren't a lot of flowers blooming with nectar sources, and there aren't a lot of insects flying around. So ruby-throated hummingbirds depend on the sap wells created by yellow-bellied sapsuckers for energy, as a major energy source as they're heading north during migration. Ornithologists have studied this, and they have found that ruby-throated hummingbirds may even time their migration to coincide with peak sapsucker migration. It's an amazing association, and you can just see that yellow-bellied sapsuckers are creating food for hummingbirds, for insects, for small mammals. It's quite the system that is set up. Let's move on now to the red-bellied woodpecker. Why on earth would this woodpecker be called a red-bellied woodpecker? When you first look at this bird, you think, gosh, I don't understand that. Well, one thing to understand is the history of bird watching, the science, the early history of ornithology and the science of birds relates back to the fact that we didn't always have binoculars, and we have not always had the advantage of binoculars for studying birds. Before the widespread use of binoculars, ornithologists and people who studied birds shot the birds in order to have the birds in their hands close up to look at them and to study them. So when red-bellied woodpeckers were first studied, people had this bird in their hand. And at that time, when you have a red-bellied woodpecker in your hand, you can see a very pale, orangish, pinkish wash, just a very pale color on the belly that I'll show you in just a minute. But I also wanted to just mention a couple other common names that this bird has been called, and you can see why. The zebraback or ladderback woodpecker, with those alternating bands of black and white on the back of the bird. Let's take a look though at that wash on the red-bellied belly. If you see a red-bellied woodpecker hanging from a suet feeder, that's a good chance to see that belly. Or if it's hanging from a branch somewhere, or if you just get lucky and see it at the right angle when it's attached to a tree somewhere, you know, moving up a tree, you will see that red belly. Red-bellied woodpeckers are very common at bird feeders, and they are very vocal. As a matter of fact, they're quite the characters. If you let your suet feeder get empty and then come and bring the suet out maybe in a couple days, they will talk to you. My red-bellied woodpeckers at Bur Oak talk to me all the time if the suet is empty. I'm coming out to fill it and they just start carrying on like they're saying to me, where have you been and why did you let this suet feeder get empty? So they're really characters, they're very vocal. Also, the female red-bellied woodpecker has a gray top of the head and then red on the nape only, compared to the male that has the red from the base of the bill all the way across the top of the head and down the nape of the head. The red-headed woodpecker is the next woodpecker that I want to cover. And remember, this bird, just like the red-bellied and the yellow-bellied sapsucker and the hairy woodpecker, they're all medium-sized woodpeckers in Ohio, and they're all about the size of a cardinal or robin.
Hey, Julie.
Yes.
Before we get into the characteristics of the red-headed woodpecker, could I ask a couple questions that came in about the last two species?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So we have a question from Michaela. She asked, How are their eyes protected from the wood particles flying around when they're pecking?
That's a great question. Woodpeckers actually have their eyes closed when they are pecking away at wood and there are pieces of wood flying around. They will close their eyes, and if you could have a slow motion video showing a woodpecker doing that, you would see that its eyes are closed.
Okay, and Sophia asks, what type of bugs do woodpeckers eat? And we had a couple similar questions about their diet. Somebody asked, what do woodpeckers eat besides bugs and sap? And I know there was another question about what do yellow-bellied sapsuckers feed their young? So lots of questions on diet. Wow,
yes. I'm going to be answering some of those questions later.
Okay.
But back to the yellow-bellied sapsucker and what would it feed its young? It would definitely be feeding young birds insects that it can find. Most birds feed their young insects, not all, that's a generalization, but definitely it would be feeding insects. And I honestly do not know if yellow-bellied sapsuckers feed their young any sap. I don't know the answer to that question. I can try to find out, or possibly Kaylin, Lauren, or Jenna in the background might be able to find out if yellow-bellied sapsuckers feed sap to their young. I really don't know that answer.
Okay, and we had a question from Melissa. She asked, is there an evolutionary advantage for the hairy and downy to look so similar?
Oh, that's a great question. And again, I don't know the answer to that. That's a fabulous question, because you would think there might be some type of evolutionary advantage.
And that's okay. Lauren found an article from audubon.org that she posted in the Q&A. So if anybody is interested in knowing more, check that out.
Okay.
And let's see. Last question before I let you get going again. We have Spooky's girl who wrote in and said, the woodpeckers I see eat at the dried fruit and nut tube feeder just as frequently, if not more frequently, as the suet feeder. Do you find any particular type of suet to be more attractive?
I have used a variety of suets throughout my years of feeding birds, and I have found that almost, and I'll clarify that in a minute, almost any suet that's labeled for woodpeckers will eat. However, I will say this, I ran out of suet once and could only find some cheap suet. It was the cheapest suet I'd ever bought, and I thought, this seems awfully inexpensive. I'm going to buy just 2 suet cakes and try it. And guess what? My woodpeckers would not eat it. So I would recommend you do not buy the cheapest suet you can find. Buy some quality suet from either a quality food, like a feed mill that you trust, or somewhere that you feel that it's a good quality suet. But you don't have to buy the most expensive suet though either. You don't. But that was my experience when I bought that cheap suet. The woodpeckers did not eat it. They totally ignored it, and I was really surprised. So any suet that's labeled for woodpeckers, many times suet that is labeled for woodpeckers has peanuts or peanut butter in it, because woodpeckers do seem to like that. But as long as you've got some beef suet, that sometimes they also like it when it's embedded with sunflower seeds, that's good too. Any of those types of suet will work.
Awesome. So just a reminder to viewers, if you do have questions, go ahead and type them in the Q&A box. But Julie, let's get back to the red-headed woodpecker.
All right, the red-headed woodpecker is a favorite of a lot of people because it's kind of different from the other woodpeckers. It's so distinctive looking. It is our only woodpecker in Ohio and the only woodpecker in the East that has a red hood. So it is very aptly named red-headed woodpecker. Other names for this bird, some common names that people have given it are flag bird because it kind of looks red, white, and blue, tricolored woodpecker, and flying checkerboard. It is so distinctive looking because not only that red hood that it's wearing, but the combination of lots of white and, you know, the white patches on the wings and then lots of black colored too. It's extremely distinctive looking. But what's very different about the red-headed woodpecker is that unlike other woodpeckers, they're adept at catching insects in the air, which is very different for woodpeckers, and they eat lots of acorns and beech nuts. They often hide their food in crevices to come back for later. So they will hide not only beech nuts and acorns and seeds, but they'll also hide insects in the cracks in wood, under bark, even under roof shingles. And it has actually been observed that these woodpeckers will regularly store grasshoppers alive, wedged into wood crevices so tightly that the grasshoppers can't escape. So this is just such an interesting behavior from this woodpecker that's different than all of our other woodpeckers. The eating of lots of acorns and then hiding away and storing food for later. Now, the northern flicker, I have to say, is probably one of my favorite woodpeckers. One reason is that it is such a handsome bird. It has all of these colors from a mauve rose color to gray to tan and brown, and then it's spotted with these black polka dots. It has a red shield on the nape of its head. The male has this black mustache. And on the front of the bird, which is hard to see from this photo, but you'll see in a minute, there's a black shield on its breast too. So it's just a handsome, very wonderful looking bird. And it's different because it's seen on the ground. I did mention the male has the red mustache. The female will not have a mustache, but she will still have that red shield on the nape. These woodpeckers rarely excavate wood, but they're on the ground because their favorite food is ants. And because their favorite food is ants, their tongue is different. This is one of those very specialized woodpecker tongues. Their tongue is flattened to provide a greater surface area, and they don't have as many barbs on the end of their tail as other woodpeckers. They also have the stickiest saliva of any of the woodpeckers. So this combination of a flattened tongue and sticky saliva allows the flicker to gather large numbers of ants at one time. The flicker has the longest tongue of any of our woodpeckers. And again, it's more flat and they have the stickier saliva and fewer barbs at the very end of the tongue. All those combinations, the flattening, the saliva, the fewer barbs, that's for collecting ants. The northern flicker was not always known as the northern flicker. In the east, it used to be called the yellow-shafted flicker, and in the west, it used to be called the red-shafted flicker. Scientists and ornithologists found that these two forms, the yellow-shafted and red-shafted, hybridize extensively, and so the decision was made to change the name to northern flicker. But honestly, I personally like the name yellow-shafted and red-shafted better because it's more descriptive of the bird. And I actually want to show you a wing and some tail feathers of the yellow-shafted variety of the northern flicker. So Alyssa, can folks see the?
Hold them up just a bit. Yeah, that's perfect.
Is that good?
Up just a tinge more, actually. Yep, right there. That is good.
Okay, so here's a wing, and and on the wing, you can really see these yellow shafts on the feather of the yellow-shafted northern flicker. And on the tail feathers, here's the upper part of the tail. And when you turn it around, wow, not only are the shafts yellow, but the feathers themselves are yellow. So you will see this here in the east, you will see this flash of yellow as a flicker flies away. And you know, oh wow, that was a flicker that just flew away. They also have a white rump, white patch on their rump when they fly away that you see. But the yellow flash is really something to see. And also, this is a good opportunity with these tail feathers to show you how stiff these feathers are. They're extremely stiff, and remember that's because woodpeckers are using these tail feathers as a prop as they go hopping up a tree. It supports the bird. So these are quite fantastic to see. Okay, I'll go back to the slides. And tell me when you're ready, Alyssa.
You're good.
Okay. Now, the last woodpecker that I'm going to talk about is the pileated or pileated woodpecker. It doesn't matter how you pronounce it. Both pronunciations are fine, pileated or pileated. Either way, that word pileated refers to the crest, the prominent red crest on this bird. Pileated woodpeckers are the largest woodpecker in North America. They are spectacular to see because they're so big and those red crest feathers. Probably they're arguably the most exciting woodpecker to see. Many people that I know can remember when they saw their first pileated woodpecker. It is a memorable thing to happen. Because when you see your first pileated woodpecker, it's just fabulous. You can't believe the size of this woodpecker right here in Ohio. It's exciting to see. The male pileated has the mustache and the female does not have the mustache. These birds are very vocal, and I want to play for you from my Merlin app on my phone some calls of the pileated woodpecker so you can hear what it sounds like. You will hear these throughout the woods, and I want you to know that this is what you're hearing. So I'm going to play a couple different calls. And here's another one. And another. Then I want you to hear the drumming sound that it makes also. Okay, so lots of loud vocal sounds this woodpecker makes that you will hear. The pileated woodpecker has a specialized tongue. That's one of those woodpecker species whose tongue is a little bit different. It's relatively short compared to other woodpeckers. Now remember, overall, it still has a very long tongue compared to other birds. But compared to other woodpeckers, its tongue is short and it has many backward-facing barbs on the end of the tongue. The pileated's tongue is short because it has so much physical strength because of its size and this large, powerful beak, which allows them to excavate into wood and get insects out without needing the extremely long tongue. Also, those backward-facing barbs on the end are sort of like fish hooks. You can think of the pileated woodpecker as going fishing. Its favorite food includes grubs and carpenter ants, which are large insects. So the bird can dip its tongue into an excavated hole, hook its prey, and then yank it out with those barbs. The female pileated, again, does not have the red mustache and has sort of a greenish, brownish looking forehead. I wanted you to see that. Also, don't be surprised if you see pileated woodpeckers eating fruit like crab apples that this woodpecker is eating in this image. They'll eat poison ivy fruit, wild grapes. And one day I was at home, looked out my back door to see two pileated woodpeckers hanging on the branches of a dogwood tree, eating the fruit of the dogwood. It was fascinating and funny actually to watch because these birds are so large, they were having a hard time balancing on the branches and limbs of the dogwood as they were going after that fruit of the dogwood. A few days later, my dogwood tree had no fruit left on it. So they will definitely eat fruit, especially in the winter time. One other thing I wanted to mention about woodpeckers is that the holes that they create for nesting are important for other wildlife too, not just for themselves. Woodpecker holes are used by other cavity nesting birds and are used by small mammals like flying squirrels. So they do create living areas in the forest by creating their nest holes that they don't, might not use the following year. It's pretty fascinating, the connections between them and other wildlife. Now that I've shown you the 7 species of woodpeckers in Ohio, I'd love to know from you how many of these Ohio woodpecker species have you seen? And you'll have a poll that you can answer that question. How many Ohio woodpecker species have you seen?
Well, Julie, there's answers still coming in, but it looks like we have a few people who have seen all 7 Ohio woodpecker species, and quite a few that have seen 5 to 6 or 3 to 4. They're, like I said, they're still coming in, so it's hard to say right now.
Sure.
But
yep, I can move on while they're still coming in, and maybe you can tell us again in a minute or so.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's really exciting to know that some of you have seen all 7. And if you haven't seen all 7, that can be a goal for you. Now that you've talked about, we've looked at these woodpecker species, and you've thought in your mind about how many have I seen, maybe which ones you have seen. What is your favorite woodpecker? I mentioned that I had an affinity for the northern flicker, And I also, I mean, how can you not? I also love the pileated woodpecker. How can you not, right? But sometimes for me, it's hard to pick a favorite. However, do you have a favorite woodpecker that you just enjoy seeing and gives you joy when you look out to see it, either at your bird feeder this time of year or in the forest as you're taking a hike and you get to see that woodpecker? What woodpecker would that be? And as people are answering that, I want to show you two species that I consider associated species, meaning you see these birds and they sort of have some of the woodpecker characteristics, kind of. Their behavior is sort of like woodpeckers, and you might see these at the feeders at the same time. One is the white-breasted nuthatch. The nuthatch is the only bird that you will see heading down a tree trunk head first. So I bet lots of you have seen white-breasted nuthatches before. And then the brown creeper, which is a favorite because brown creepers are so well camouflaged that when they're moving up a tree trunk, it looks like there's a tree knot, K-N-O-T, that this knot of the tree is moving around the tree because the brown creepers are so well camouflaged with tree bark. So these two species will also visit your suet feeders. They make use of the tree trunks and move around on tree trunks like woodpeckers do. And I just wanted to mention those two species. So do we have any more results, Alyssa?
We do. So for the third question, how many Ohio woodpecker species have you seen? 46% of people, excuse me, let me start with the most. 35% of people have said all 7, and 46% of people, which is the most obviously that have responded, said 5 to 6. So the majority of people, 5 to 6.
That's great. That's awesome.
Yeah, and then for the other question, the answers are still coming in there, but we have, let's see, red-headed, northern flicker, red-bellied. I'm probably going to mispronounce this, even though I've heard you say it. Pileated? Did I say that right?
That's fine. Yep, that's right.
And then we have 3, like I see 3 Downy on here. Somebody says all of them. That's a great answer.
I know.
So.
I have maybe, looks like I have a couple minutes. I want to, first I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much for all of your questions and your interest and your love of woodpeckers. I do want to show one more thing real quick because this doesn't relate to Ohio woodpeckers, but it relates to woodpeckers. And that is the ghost with wings, the ivory-billed woodpecker, a fascinating bird that is thought to be extinct. This photo was taken in 1935 in Louisiana. It's one of the last photos taken of the ivory-billed woodpecker. And there was a possible sighting back in 2005 in Arkansas. I actually even had a friend who went to Arkansas looking for the ivory-billed woodpecker when this sighting was reported. Where this happened in this wetland and swamp area, they invited volunteers to come in and search because the woodpecker had been caught, they thought, on a camera that was attached to a tree. So who knows? It's sort of a mystery. Maybe there's still a couple ivory-billed woodpeckers out there. We don't know. The chances aren't real high, but I always hold on to some hope that the ghost with wings is still out there somewhere.
And we do have a few questions to wrap up the webinar, if you wouldn't mind answering them, Julie. Chris asks, what small animals do woodpeckers sometimes eat? And which species of woodpeckers are likely to eat the small animals?
I have not seen any research about woodpeckers eating small mammals. My guess would be that if you have seen that somewhere, I would think it'd be the larger woodpeckers that would do that, and I would think mice or voles maybe. But honestly, I've never read that before in any information about woodpeckers. So I, from my own personal experience, I can't say. I don't know if Jenna, Lauren, or Kaylin might know the answer to that.
In the Southwest, it's been documented that they'll eat like snakes or lizards. So it would not be unfathomable as a larger woodpecker up here comes across a really small garter snake and maybe decides to eat it. So I would say probably not mammals, but maybe potentially a small snake.
Okay.
Thanks, Lauren.
And let's see. Why is the northern flicker considered a woodpecker? Is it the tongue and skull?
Yeah, it's all the adaptations that I mentioned. It's the skull, it's the tongue, it's the zygodactyl feet, it's where it lives. Even though it's an ant eater, you still see it in forest areas. And even though it tends to not excavate holes, that's not something that it commonly does, it still is a cavity nester. It has all those features that the woodpeckers have. Most of the same adaptations that make a woodpecker a woodpecker. That's a great question.
And can you tell us again what the app was that you used for the sounds, Julie? We have a couple people wanting to know what that app was.
Yeah, that's the fabulous app called Merlin, MERLIN, the Merlin app. It's free and it's from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. I highly recommend it.
Okay. Maggie asks, I have yet to see a yellow-bellied sapsucker. What's the best way to seek one out? Do they prefer one type of habitat over another or have a favorite tree that they prefer?
They are definitely found most of the time. You always have to qualify with most instead of always, but most of the time in a forest situation. They do prefer birch and maple trees when they're making their sap wells. But remember, they can be found on over 1,000 different types of trees and woody plants. So don't say to yourself, oh, I don't have any maple trees. I've seen sapsucker holes in a wide variety of trees. And the best time to see them in Ohio is right now. Again, I live on a forested property and they come every winter to my suet feeders. I see them every winter. So if you don't live somewhere close to a forest, you might seek out a park that has suet feeders out, that you could watch those suet feeders and keep an eye on those for yellow-bellied sapsuckers coming in. And it would need to be in mostly southern Ohio, because usually they're going to spend the winter, if we're talking about Ohio only, it's going to be in the southern part of Ohio.
Okay, and a couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up. Casey asks, were the ivory-billed woodpeckers historically found in Ohio?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. I know that they tended to be more of a southern, like that picture that was taken in Louisiana. Think of Louisiana swamp areas and wetland areas. I'm not sure. That is definitely something I would have to look up if they were common in Ohio or if they were more along in the southern states like Louisiana and Georgia and the Carolinas and Florida, with more of those type of wetland areas. That would be my guess. That would be my educated guess.
Okay, and we'll end on a very easy question for you, Julie. Patty asks, where is Burr Oak State Park? It is beautiful, so let's give a shout out to Burr Oak, and if you could tell people where they can come to visit it.
Yes, please come find us. It's in Southeast Ohio. Closest major city is Athens. It's about a half hour northeast of Athens. And also Nelsonville. It's about a half hour from Nelsonville, if you know Nelsonville. So it's sort of out away from any major city. The closest town is called Gloucester. Come see us, please. And what makes it nice, because it is away from any major city, it's a very quiet, peaceful place. But there's a lodge there. You can stay at the lodge. It has a restaurant there. We have cabins and a campground to stay at. So there's lots of different lodging choices for you also.
Okay, thank you, Julie. And thanks to all of our viewers. We had a wonderful crowd today. And thanks to Kaylin, Jenna, and Lauren, who have been helping answer questions. Just before we go, I want to remind you, we do have more webinars, wonderful webinars scheduled for you. So we hope to see you soon. Coming up is on February 3rd at 10 a.m. Hibernation Fascination. Our naturalists are going to continue doing some webinars on different species around Ohio. So the Hibernation Fascination is kind of in part to celebrate Groundhog Day, like I said. Also on February 17th, we're going to be doing a webinar on bobcats. So please join us for that. And then we have some to celebrate Black History Month. I'm super excited for these. On February 9th at 10, we are going to be talking about the Underground Railroad, that remnants of it exist on some of our state parks and state forest lands. And on February 10th at 10, we have a guest speaker, Dr. Andrew Fate from Shawnee State University, who is going to be giving us all the details about African American history in Ohio's Little Smokies. And then lastly, February 23rd, we will be talking about the CCC legacy. If you don't know what the CCC is, it's the Civilian Conservation Corps, and there were many African American camps in the CCC that helped build the infrastructure for our beautiful state parks and state forests that we have today. So please join us. If you want to check those out, you can go to our Facebook page, or you can check them out on our website. There's a virtual programming tab that you can find there. Just search OhioDNR virtual programming and it'll all come up for you, or the link is in the Q&A box. Last but not least, if you missed anything today and you want to go back and watch it, go to our YouTube page, OhioDNR. Just search that on YouTube and you can find all of our archived webinars and short videos there. Until next time, have a good one.